All right, so let's start this week's midweek magic off with a somewhat brief primer on sealed in general, because there are some differences between sealed and what I think probably most of you are more familiar with, draft. So whether you stand by Bread's bomb and removal based philosophy, or perhaps you've moved on to Keto's more efficient, evasive creature base, it's fair to say that Limited tends to be about playing your very best cards. And more often than not, that means your bombs and your premium removal. I know most of the times when I'm building a sealed pool, the first thing I do is look at my rares and mythics to see what bombs I have and what's worth building around, and then see how that lines up with the removal pieces that I got in the pool. Secondly, you need to make sure you have a reasonable curve to the cards that you're playing. You need enough things in your 1, 2, and 3 drop slots that means you won't get run over in the early game, because if you don't do anything until turn 3, you're probably going to die on turn 4. On the other side of that coin, of course, you want to make sure you have enough things at your top end, your 4, 5, and 6, and beyond slots in some cases, that you have late threats that allow you to go over the top if the board state has stalled. One of the often overlooked factors of having a successful sealed event is having the right balance between your creatures, your spells, and your lands. And traditional thinking is to have approximately 16 creatures, 7 spells, and 17 lands. And for most formats, that is going to be pretty right there. I don't recommend going outside of that unless you have a very good format-specific thing. One of the recent ones has been Khans of Tarkir, where going to 18 lands was often very relevant, thereby cutting a non-creature spell. The lack of card selection in a sealed pool typically means you want to avoid those more aggro-aggressive decks. It's very hard to open a random pool and get enough synergy there to make that work. Of course, if you do happen to open a very good aggressive pool, something like a red-white aggro, there's no reason to not play it. It's just not very likely. And of course, Magic is always going to be a game of turns, which is defined by drawing cards. So our old friend card advantage is always going to be relevant. More often than not, playing a card that grants you some form of card advantage is going to be a very good thing. In sealed, it is statistically advantageous to take the draw. Yep. You heard me right. I know this goes kind of against the conventional wisdom of Magic that being on the play is good, but when it comes to sealed, the concepts of the limited pool, card advantage, and the less likelihood of playing an aggro deck means taking the draw leads to more wins. Of course, again, if you happen to open and run that rare aggro pool, this might go the other way. And in sealed, much like many other limited environments, it's a good idea to save your removal for when your opponent drops those bombs. Sure, you can use your 2-drop removal to take out their 1 or 2 drop, but you're really going to hate that decision when they drop that late game 6/6 evasive creature. And of course, it really makes sense to know as much about the limited environment as you possibly can. But of course, early in the season like this, that can be problematic. What I do highly recommend is take a few minutes and know the combat tricks that are going to be relevant for that particular limited environment, because there's nothing worse than getting blown out in the red zone. Alright, so now let's talk about some easy ways to identify those combat tricks for any particular sealed format. And it doesn't matter which individual set that you select. One of the more popular ones recently has been the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth, so we're going to go with that. I also suggest that you just look at the commons and uncommons, because those are the ones that you're going to see most often in a limited environment. And of course, don't forget to select not collected. That way, if it's very early in the season and you don't have very many cards yet, you're going to see even things you don't own. The last thing you want to do is select instance. Anything that doesn't happen at instant speed is really not a combat trick. From there, you would type in the search selection until end of turn. That's going to give you all of your stuff out there that applies a bonus, a state-based effect, whatever, to a creature until the end of turn. It can change its power to toughness, it can apply bonuses, it can create a food token, all sorts of different things out there. The next thing that you really want to look at is the phrase +1 counter. And of course, this is going to bring up every counter spell in the book as well. But there's not a lot that you can do about that. And that is going to bring up any instant that instead of just applying a temporary bonus, places a counter and subsequently also changes combat map. And then the last thing to consider is any sort of permanent. So we're going to take off the instance and with flash. So any creature that can come down in the middle of combat. Generally, we're talking about creatures, but very often more recent sets, you're starting to see things like artifacts and general equipments, enchantments, things like that with flash. And all of those can be used to mess with that combat state and create some unexpected results. And lastly, keep in mind anything that has a destroy effect or a direct damage effect is not necessarily a combat trick, but rather is just plain old removal. And not to say that isn't important, but that is part of the earlier conversation when you're evaluating your bombs and your removal. All right, so to sum that up into 3 quick points, play your bombs and removal. Build your deck with the right mix of cards and a successful curve. And lastly, be sure to know your combat tricks. And a bit of a bonus tip, if you're not confident in your own card evaluation skills, be sure on Arena to use an AI for your sealed pools, and that'll tell you what your best bombs, your best removal, your best combat tricks, all of those things will be pointed out to you very clearly, and it will even suggest a complete deck build. So with all of that and a little bit of luck, and the actual contents of your pool should come together to give you a successful sealed event, whether you're talking about a pre-release, whether you are talking about a sealed event on Arena, or something like a midweek Magic Phantom Sealed.